He didn't lead the league in points, he wasn't flashy, and he didn't chase the spotlight, but every single player in the NHLs knew exactly where he was at all times. Because if you didn't, it was lights out. He was 6'2", just over 200 pounds, and wore the C on his chest like it meant something. He didn't need to trash talk, he didn't need to fight. All he had to do was stare across the ice, and even the toughest guys in the league felt it. This was a man who could change a game without touching the puck, a defenseman who played with so much power, control, and intensity that crossing the middle of the ice became a risk players weren't always willing to take. His name was Scott Stevens, and during his prime, he wasn't just a great player, he was a nightmare. Stevens became a symbol of fear in the NHL, not because he wanted to hurt people, but because he played the game with an old school edge that demanded respect. His hits didn't just knock you down, they made you think twice about standing back up. And for all the highlight reel checks and massive collisions, Stevens was more than just a bruiser. He was the emotional heart of the New Jersey Devils, the leader of a dynasty that won 3 Stanley Cups, and a player who set the tone every single night. You might think of fear in hockey as something that comes from fights or big brawls, but Stevens proved that real fear came from timing, precision, and presence. He could turn the momentum of an entire playoff series with a single hit. Just ask Eric Lindros, ask Paul Kariya, ask anyone who tried to skate through the middle while number 4 was on the ice. But if Stevens hadn't become that kind of player, if he hadn't turned himself into the most feared man in the league, what would have happened? Maybe the Devils don't win those cups. Maybe they never become the defensive powerhouse that frustrated superstars and dominated the early 2000s. Maybe the era of tight, physical, shutdown hockey never takes off. Because for all the stars with speed and skill, the game still needed guys like Stevens, guys who made sure nothing came easy. He helped shape the way teams were built, he helped rewrite what it meant to be a captain, and he showed that respect in hockey doesn't come from goals. It comes from showing up every single night, standing your ground, and protecting your team at all costs. Scott Stevens wasn't just feared because of how hard he hit, he was feared because of everything he stood for. Scott Stevens was born in Kitchener, Ontario, a hockey town through and through. Like most Canadian kids, he started skating before he even knew how to tie his own skates. Winters meant frozen ponds, neighborhood games, and battles for bragging rights. But there was something different about Scott, even back then. He didn't just play hockey, he lived it. He wasn't the biggest kid on the ice at first, but he played like he was. There was no off switch. Every shift, every stride, every hit, it all had purpose. Coaches and parents saw it early. This kid didn't care if it was a game or practice, he went full speed. Full contact, every time. By the time he hit his teen, Scott started to fill out. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and more importantly, a motor that never seemed to run out. He wasn't a natural goal scorer, but he didn't need to be. He was aggressive, smart, and physical, and that separated him fast. In junior hockey, he joined the Kitchener Rangers of the OHL, and from the start it was obvious. This wasn't a kid you could push around. He wasn't dirty, he wasn't reckless, but when you came down his side of the ice, you felt him. His body checks were clean but punishing. His timing was already elite, and even though he was only 16 or 17, he was already making grown men nervous. Scouts were watching closely. At first, some wondered if he was too aggressive, if he'd take too many penalties. But the more they saw, the more they realized he wasn't just a hitter, he was a thinker. Stevens read the game like a pro. He knew when to step up, when to stay back, and how to make people pay without taking dumb risks. In the 1982 NHL draft, the Washington Capitals picked him 5th overall. It was the highest they had ever picked a defenseman at that time. But even then, there were questions. He wasn't a flashy puck mover. He didn't have the finesse of guys like Paul Coffey or Ray Bourque. What he had was grit, toughness, and a raw intensity that couldn't be taught. Stevens wasn't a superstar yet, but Washington believed he had something special. At 18 years old, he went straight from juniors into the NHL, skipping the minors entirely. That alone told you how ready he was. Most rookies take time to adjust. Stevens jumped in, started hitting, and never looked back. From the beginning, his mindset was simple. Outwork everyone. He didn't try to be the guy who danced around defenders. That wasn't his game. He wanted to outmuscle you. He wanted to break up plays before they even started. And most of all, he wanted you to know if you were anywhere near his zone, he was coming. He didn't throw hits just to pump up the crowd. He threw them to send messages. That's the difference. His game wasn't about flash, it was about force. Controlled, disciplined, dangerous force. But Stevens didn't become feared overnight. In those early NHL years, he still thought he had to prove he could do everything, carry the puck, jump into the rush, make the pretty plays. And for a while, he tried. He had seasons with solid point totals, but deep down, that wasn't who he was. There was a moment when that clicked. When he looked around the locker room, looked at the scoreboard, and realized something. He didn't need to play like the other stars. The team didn't need him to be flashy. They needed him to be himself, the punishing force of nature who made life hell for opposing forwards. Scott Stevens came into the NHL like a wrecking ball, but he didn't start that way. In fact, when the Washington Capitals drafted him 5th overall in 1982, most people thought they were picking a reliable two-way defenseman, someone strong, steady, and responsible. Nobody expected he'd become the most feared man in hockey. Right away, Stevens joined the Capitals lineup as an 18-year-old, skipping the minors completely. That doesn't happen unless a team believes you're special, and Stevens proved them right. He was strong, physical, and had a natural feel for positioning. His first few years were more about building trust than building fear, but the pieces were already there. In the locker room, teammates noticed his habits, early to practice. First one in the gym, quiet but focused. One teammate remembered, "You could feel it. He wasn't just trying to play defense, he was trying to own the ice." Coaches praised his ability to read plays before they happened. His hits weren't wild. They were timed like clockwork. And even though he had a strong offensive side, putting up solid point totals, it was his physical play that stood out. Opponents began circling games against Washington on the calendar, not because of their record, but because of one guy, number 3. By 1990, Stevens was team captain and the backbone of the Capitals. But then came a moment that would flip his whole career upside down. That summer, he signed a record-setting contract with the St. Louis Blues. It made him the highest-paid defenseman in the NHL, and Washington didn't match the offer. Just like that, Stevens was gone. But the chaos didn't stop there. As part of the offer sheet rules at the time, the Blues had to give Washington 5 first-round picks as compensation. It was controversial, and it put the spotlight firmly on Stevens' shoulders. Now he wasn't just a hard-hitting defenseman, he was a marked man, expected to lead a new team and justify a massive deal. Stevens played just 1 season in St. Louis. Statistically, it was strong. He scored 49 points and wore Captain's C on his chest, but drama behind the scenes was already brewing. The Blues had also signed Brendan Shanahan, and the New Jersey Devils filed a claim, saying St. Louis still owed them a player from an earlier contract violation. The NHL agreed, and the player they demanded in return was Scott Stevens. Stevens didn't want to leave. He had just found his groove in St. Louis, but the league's decision was final. He was now a New Jersey Devil. No trade, no negotiation, just a ruling. At first, he was frustrated. The Devils were not a winning team at the time, and Stevens had no say in the move. But as time passed, things began to click. New Jersey wasn't flashy, but it was disciplined, quiet, tough. In other words, it was the perfect place for him. Under Lou Lamoriello's leadership, the Devils were building a system that prized structure and accountability. Stevens fit in like a glove. But this is where his transformation truly began. He stopped chasing big point totals. He stopped trying to be everything, and he fully committed to being the enforcer. In practice, he was relentless. A young Martin Brodeur once said, "If Scott gave you a look, you knew to keep your head up, and that was in practice. Imagine what opponents felt." Stevens didn't have to yell. His body language said everything. Players around the league started to notice. Coaches warned their guys before every game, "Don't go through the middle when Stevens is out there." But some didn't listen, and that's when the highlights began. In the early 90s, the NHL still celebrated big hits, but Stevens was different. His hits didn't just stop plays, they ended them. One check could change the energy of a game, and while the league hadn't yet implemented rules around blindside or head hits, Stevens' style forced those conversations to start. Quietly, his name was being mentioned in meetings about player safety, even if no rules had changed yet. On the ice, the respect was real. Opponents hated playing against him, but many admired what he brought. One rival forward said, "He wasn't dirty, he was just terrifying. You always had to know where he was." Stevens also earned the trust of young players in the Devils' room. He showed them how to train, how to play honest, and how to take pride in the ugly parts of the game, clearing the net, taking a hit, blocking a shot. The young core, Niedermeyer, Brodeur, Elias, all saw him as the guy who walked the walk. There was no ego, just effort. Eventually, he was named captain of the Devils, and this time, it felt right. He wasn't just wearing the C, he was the team. And as the hits got harder and the playoff games more intense, Stevens became something you don't see often in sports. A player who changed how other teams played the game. By now, he knew exactly what kind of player he was. He wasn't going to win scoring titles. He wasn't going to be the face of flashy highlight reels. But he didn't care. He had found his purpose, and he was about to use it to lead a team to greatness. By the mid-90s, Scott Stevens wasn't just the captain of the New Jersey Devils. He was the soul of a team that played with discipline, control, and bone-rattling intensity. He didn't need to yell in the locker room or showboat on the ice. His presence alone told the story. And in 1995, that story took its first step into history. The Devils came into the playoffs as underdogs. They were a gritty, defensive team in a league still ruled by flashy scorers and freewheeling offenses. But Stevens didn't care about style. He cared about results. And game by game, hit by hit, he led the Devils through the Eastern Conference like a bulldozer clearing a path. They swept the Red Wings in the Stanley Cup Final. Not beat, swept. The team that was supposed to be too powerful, too skilled, too fast, couldn't break through New Jersey's wall. At the center of it all was Stevens, not just leading on the stat sheet, but setting the tone every single shift. He didn't have to throw a big hit every night, but when he did, you felt it. And the Red Wings felt it in that series. The Devils frustrated Detroit so badly that Hall of Famer Dino Ciccarelli famously said after the series, "I'd never want to play on a team like that." That's how miserable Stevens and the Devils made them feel. That cup win was more than a championship. It was a warning. The league had changed. Defense could win. Discipline could dominate. And Stevens, with his terrifying calm and violent precision, was the symbol of that change. But as great as 1995 was, it was just the beginning. From 2000 to 2003, the Devils became a true dynasty, and Stevens was at the absolute peak of his power. By then, his reputation was fully formed. Teammates said it was like playing with a force field. Opponents knew better than to cross the blue line with their heads down. And fans, they waited for that moment every game. The one where Stevens would make the entire arena explode with a single devastating check. In the 2000 playoffs, he had one of the most iconic moments in NHL history. It was Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Final, Devils versus Flyers. Tension so thick you could feel it through the TV screen. Midway through the second period, Eric Lindros carried the puck over the blue line, head down for a split second, just one. That was all Stevens needed. Boom! A collision that shook the building. Lindros went limp on the ice. The crowd gasped. The benches fell silent. Broadcasters paused mid-sentence. It wasn't just a hit, it was a turning point. The Devils went on to win the game and eventually the Stanley Cup. But that hit, that became part of hockey history. Some called it brutal, some said it crossed a line, but under the rules at the time, it was legal. And it wasn't dirty, it was precise. Shoulders in, feet planted, eyes locked in. It was everything Stevens stood for. Years later, Stevens was asked about it. He didn't boast, he didn't even smile. He just said, "You have to be aware on the ice. That's part of the game." Lindros, one of the most powerful forwards of his era, never played another game for the Flyers after that hit. Then came 2003, another playoff run, another title, another hit, this time, Paul Kariya. It was Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final, Devils versus Ducks. Kariya picked up the puck and skated through the neutral zone. Again, just a moment of vulnerability. Head turned, wrong angle. Stevens stepped up. The sound of the hit echoed across the arena. Kariya went down hard. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Trainers rushed out, the crowd held its breath. And then, Kariya came back. Minutes later, he returned to the ice and scored a goal. One of the most emotional comebacks the game has ever seen. But still, that hit is what people remember, because it showed exactly who Stevens was. Always waiting, always watching, always ready to strike. Kariya later said in interviews, "I don't remember anything from that moment." That's the kind of impact Stevens had both physically and psychologically. It wasn't just the stars he hit, it was how the hits changed the game. Coaches built game plans around avoiding him. Players changed their skating patterns just to stay out of his zone. Teams were scared to carry the puck through the neutral zone because number 4 was always lurking. One player years later said, "We used to joke that the safest place on the ice was the boards when Stevens was out there. Because the middle, that was his." Even TV broadcasters started calling it the Stevens zone, a place in the neutral zone where forwards disappeared, either off the puck or off the ice. But it wasn't just fear that made Stevens great, it was respect. Because underneath the chaos and crushing hits, he was still a master of the game. He read plays before they developed. He shut down scoring lanes before they opened. He blocked shots, he cleared the crease, and he never took a shift off. Teammates said he raised the standard. If you saw Stevens giving 100% every night, you couldn't give 95. That's why the Devils were so consistent. They weren't always the most skilled team, but they were always the hardest to play against, and it started with their captain. By the end of the 2003 playoffs, Stevens had captained his team to 3 Stanley Cups. He wasn't scoring highlight reel goals, but he was making sure the other team didn't score anything. When you think of playoff warriors, the guys who sacrifice everything for their team, Stevens is at the top of that list. Bumps, bruises, broken bones, he played through it all. Because to him, pain was part of the job, and winning was the only result that mattered. That era, the late 90s and early 2000s, will always be remembered for Stevens' dominance. Not because he chased glory, but because he ruined the chances of those who did. By the early 2000s, the Devils had become one of the NHL's most respected franchises. 3 Stanley Cups in less than a decade, consistent playoff success, and a style of hockey that frustrated even the league's biggest stars. And at the center of it all was Scott Stevens. not just as a player, but as a leader. He wasn't the loudest voice in the locker room. In fact, many of his teammates described him as quiet, even shy at times. But when Stevens spoke, everyone listened, because when your captain gives everything every single night, you don't question him, you follow him. One of the most important relationships in Stevens' career was with goaltender Martin Brodeur. Together, they were the backbone of the Devils' dynasty. Brodeur once said, "I always knew Stevens had my back. I could focus on stopping the puck because I knew he'd clear the crease, protect the zone, and lead the charge." They trusted each other completely. Brodeur was the calm, steady wall in net. Stevens was the armored tank in front of him, and together, they built a defensive system that was nearly impossible to crack. Lou Lamoriello, the longtime general manager of the Devils, had a vision when he built the team. He didn't chase superstars. He wanted character, discipline, and commitment, and Stevens embodied all three. He was Lou's ideal player, tough, unselfish, and completely focused on the team. Lou once said, "When you build a team, you don't just need talent, you need a culture." And Scott Stevens was our culture. Stevens didn't chase points or personal glory. He didn't complain about ice time or line pairings. He focused on the small things: positioning, physical presence, closing gaps, blocking shots, taking hits to make plays, and those small things built the foundation for 3 championship teams. But his impact went beyond just doing the job. He taught others how to do the job. Young defensemen in New Jersey didn't just learn systems, they studied Stevens. Guys like Brian Rafalski and Paul Martin watched how he carried himself, how he never showed up late, how he never blamed others, how he never stopped working. One story that stuck with teammates happened during a practice in the middle of a long road trip. The team was tired, dragging their feet. Then Stevens took the ice, full speed, every drill, no shortcuts. After that, no one coasted again. Because if your 37-year-old captain is diving for loose pucks in practice, what excuse do you have? That's what made him different. It wasn't just the hits or the highlights, it was the accountability he brought to the room. You didn't want to let him down, not because you were scared of him, but because you respected him. Stevens' leadership style was simple: show up, do the work, protect the team. That team-first mindset was always visible on the ice. He didn't hunt for goals, he hunted for ways to shut down the other team's top players. You'd see him shadow superstars like Jaromir Jagr, Peter Forsberg, or Mats Sundin, not with speed, but with perfect positioning and endless pressure. He'd wear them down shift after shift until they had nothing left to give. In an era filled with offensive talent, Stevens made sure those talents didn't control the game, and his teammates fed off that. When your captain plays like every game is Game 7, you rise to that level too. That's why the Devils were so hard to play against. It wasn't just systems or structure, it was the mindset Stevens brought. The belief that no play was too small, no assignment too boring, no mistake too minor to correct. That attention to detail became the Devils' identity. And off the ice, he wasn't just respected, he was admired. Opposing players may have feared Stevens during games, but off the ice, many saw him as one of the most honorable players in the league. No trash talk, no dirty play, just honest, hard-nosed hockey. After the 2003 Cup win, several young players said that playing with Stevens changed their careers. They learned what it meant to be a professional, how to handle success, how to deal with pressure, how to treat the game with respect. That's a legacy most players never leave. When people talk about leadership in hockey, they usually point to captains who gave rousing speeches or carried teams on their backs with goals. But Stevens led in a different way. He didn't need a microphone. His leadership was felt in how he trained, how he played, and how he made everyone around him better. He never asked for attention. He never demanded praise. And that's what made it even more powerful. In many ways, Stevens wasn't just leading a team, he was setting the standard for an entire generation of defensemen. A standard built on sacrifice, toughness, and complete commitment to the group. Even on years after he retired, you'll still hear players and coaches mention his name when talking about what it means to be a real leader. Not because he said the right things, but because he did the right things. That's the mark of true leadership. And it's why the Devils didn't just win championships. They built a dynasty, one shift, one block, one unshakable captain at a time. For all the respect Scott Stevens earned during his career, there's no denying the other side of his legacy, the criticism, the debates, and the long shadow his biggest hits left behind. When people talk about Stevens today, the same names always come up: Lindros, Correa, Kozlov. Some see those hits as masterpieces of timing and toughness. Others see them as examples of everything that was wrong with the old school NHL. The truth is, the game was different back then. Head hits weren't illegal, open ice checks were celebrated, not punished, and Stevens was playing by the rules of his time. But that doesn't mean there weren't questions. Even back then about the cost, fans watching at home often gasped when Stevens landed a hit, not just because of the impact, but because of what came next. Players knocked out, motionless, groggy, some never quite the same. And as concussion awareness grew, so did the debate. Were Stevens' hits clean or just dangerous? Ask his teammates and they'll tell you he was never dirty. He never targeted heads, never elbowed or left his feet. He timed his hits perfectly, squared up, shoulder in, feet planted. He wasn't trying to hurt people, he was trying to stop them. One former teammate said, if those hits were illegal, then every defenseman in that era should have been suspended. Stevens just did it better than everyone else. But ask some of the players on the other end of those collisions, and the answers are more complicated. Eric Lindros never said much publicly, but his body told the story. Multiple concussions, a shortened prime, a career that never hit its full potential. Paul Kariya, years later, admitted he had no memory of the moment Stevens hit him. He returned in that game, scored a goal, became a legend, but the long-term effects of that hit followed him well beyond the ice. In today's NHL, there's no doubt those hits would be viewed differently. The league has since cracked down on blindside contact and headshots. There are suspensions now for the kind of collisions that once made highlight reels. If Stevens played in the modern game, it's likely he would have faced disciplinary action, not because he was a dirty player, but because the league's priorities have changed. And that's where the debate lives, not in black and white, but in the gray area between era and evolution. Stevens himself has never been one to defend or deny. When asked about those hits, he usually answers the same way, calm, respectful, and firm. I can take a hit and I can give a hit. I don't care who it is. No one gets a free ride out there. I don't get a free ride and no one gets a free ride from me. Some fans see him as a hero, others as a symbol of a more brutal time. But no matter where you land, one thing is clear. Scott Stevens made people feel something. He brought intensity, he sparked emotion, he left a mark. And maybe that's why his legacy still sparks debate, because fear, respect, and controversy are often separated by nothing more than a hit and a moment frozen in time. By 2004, the game had started to shift. The NHL was slowly becoming faster, more open, and more focused on skill than pure physicality. For years, Scott Stevens had been the standard of power and control on defense. But after 2 decades of punishing hockey, his body had taken its share of hits too. In January 2004, he suffered a serious concussion, ironically not from a hit he delivered, but from one he received. He missed the rest of the season, and when the league returned from the lockout in 2005, Stevens quietly decided it was time. At 41 years old, he officially announced his retirement. There was no big farewell tour, no long press conference, just a short statement and a thank you to the Devils and their fans. That was his style. Humble, quiet, respectful, the kind of goodbye you'd expect from a guy who let his game speak louder than his words. But Stevens didn't walk away from hockey completely. In 2012, he returned to the Devils in a new role, this time behind the bench. As an assistant coach, he helped mentor a new generation of defensemen, sharing what he knew about positioning, toughness, and reading the game. He didn't try to turn players into copies of himself. Instead, he helped them find their own identity, just like he had years earlier. Players who worked with him said he was patient, thoughtful, and surprisingly calm. He didn't talk much about the old days, unless someone asked. And when they did, he never bragged. He simply explained what the game meant to him. In interviews, Stevens has opened up more in retirement. He's acknowledged that the game has changed and that it needed to. He understands the league's efforts to protect players and reduce dangerous hits. But he also stands by how he played. I never wanted to hurt anyone, he once said. I just wanted to play hard, protect my teammates, and win hockey games. Today, he still lives in New Jersey, still watches the Devils, still carries himself with the same quiet strength that made him a legend. And while he's no longer throwing hits, his impact is still felt in the culture he helped build, the banners he helped raise, and the standard he left behind. For young players coming into the league, especially defensemen, his name still matters. Not just for the hits or the cups or the highlights, but for the way he approached the game, with pride, with discipline, with heart. That's the real legacy of Scott Stevens. Scott Stevens didn't retire with the most goals, the most assists, or the flashiest highlight reel. But the moment his jersey was raised to the rafters in New Jersey, nobody questioned his greatness. The crowd stood for minutes, cheering for a player who had given them everything, not just through stats, but through sacrifice. The Devils retired his number 4 jersey in 2006. A year later, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. It wasn't just about the championships. It wasn't about the fear. It was about what he stood for: leadership, toughness, and the belief that effort, real, gritty effort, still matters. For 22 seasons, Stevens showed up to the rink with the same mindset: protect the house, defend your teammates, and make life miserable for the other team. And for fans, that kind of commitment is unforgettable. To this day, Devils fans still talk about him like he never left. Whether it's a father explaining to his kid why you never skate him through the middle with your head down, or an old fan rewatching the Lindros hit on a grainy YouTube clip, one thing's clear: Scott Stevens left a mark. And it's not just fans who remember. Even today, young defensemen entering the league are told about Stevens. Not because they're expected to play like him, the game has changed, but because they're expected to prepare like him, to care like him, to carry themselves like professionals on and off the ice, because that's what Stevens did. He didn't chase attention, he didn't need headlines, he earned respect by showing up, doing the job, and never backing down. Of course, his legacy comes with controversy. Some still argue about the hits, about the damage they may have caused. But even that's part of the story, because Stevens represented a time in hockey where toughness was worn like armor. Where pain wasn't avoided, it was accepted as the cost of doing business. He played in the gray area between fear and respect, and somehow, he found the balance. You didn't have to love the way he played, but if you understood hockey, truly understood it, you had to respect it. As former teammate Ken Daneyko said, Stevens didn't just play defense. He controlled the ice. When he was out there, you knew you had to be better. That's real power. In a league filled with skill and speed, Scott Stevens reminded the world that character still matters. That being great isn't always about highlight goals or personal stats. Sometimes, greatness is wearing the C quietly, throwing the perfect hit at the perfect time, and walking away like it was just another shift. He didn't need the spotlight. He was the spotlight. He didn't lead with words. He led with presence. He didn't chase records. He chased wins. And for 20 years, no one in the NHL skated with more pride, pain, or punishment than number 4 in red and black. He didn't score the most points. He didn't have the flashiest style. But somehow, Scott Stevens became the one player nobody wanted to cross. For 2 decades, he protected his teammates, punished opponents, and played the game the only way he knew how. Full speed, full effort, no shortcuts. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously. Stories like Stevens's remind us why we love hockey. Not just for the goals, but for the grit, the sacrifice, and the leaders who left everything on the ice. We started this story by saying Stevens didn't need the spotlight, and now you know why. He was the spotlight, the quiet storm who helped build a dynasty and redefined what it meant to be feared. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't miss our next video. Top 10 legendary captains in NHL history. From Mark Messier and Steve Yzerman to Sidney Crosby, we break down the greatest leaders ever to wear the C and the legacies they left behind. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.